me just quickly share my screen. Right. So I first just wanted to talk to the student cohort again. On Tuesday, I tried to make a light-hearted, somewhat satirical comment about stupid questions, and on Tuesday night, I lay in bed thinking, maybe you forgot about the fact that jokes are also culturally, and humor is also culturally specific, and maybe I might have offended some of you. So what I actually wanted to say is just that I don't think there are stupid questions. Questions come from a position of not knowing any question. It's a position of wanting more information. So in that sense, I really believe that there are no stupid questions. There might be wrong questions in academia. You might be asking the wrong question for what you are looking for, and that is part of. We discussed this. It was discussed yesterday also in one of the workshops, Q&As. But so yes, I just wanted to say, if my attempt at being funny went against your sensitivities, then I apologize, and I really don't think there are stupid questions. Right. So let me just right. So today I want to get into the detail of translation and semiotics. What came before was more like context and background and philosophical assumptions, and hopefully today would be a bit more direct about meaning making and translation. Right. So just a historical overview. Translation studies, I think, amongst disciplines is still a relatively fledgling field. Maybe not fledgling anymore, maybe teenager. And in certain circles, it's assumed or argued that it started as a field of study during and after the Second World War. Brian Baer, however, has published very interesting data from Russian work, the formalists, for instance, doing very interesting work on translation theory quite before the Second World War. But that said, over the past 70 years, if we take the 1940s, well, it's also 80 years already, the field has seen quite a number of turns. And I've discussed this the other day also briefly. We could roughly talk about a linguistic turn, a pragmatic turn in the 80s, cultural turn in the 1990s, sociological turn in the 2000s with the development of also social emergence and theories about that. And if you want to make a distinction between the sociological turn and activist agency ideological turns, you could do so. This is not supposed to be a final kind of categorization, just giving you the background. My argument around this is that despite the various reconceptualizations and expansions of the sort of the field, these turns, much of it still focuses on interlingual translation. Now, as you would have heard over the past few days, there is some disagreement about how much and about how much intersemiotic translation is needed in the field. So my claims here are, I hope, relative. So from my perspective, where I would like to see translation fully conceptualized as a semiotic activity, I think that we're not there yet. But some other people might think that it's not necessary. I must also say that there could be an argument to maintain the term translation studies for interlingual translation only, if you wanted to make that argument. I think you're going to run into problems because most texts these days are no longer purely lingual, but multimodal. But if you wanted to do that, theoretically, there would be a case to be made. So I'm not a missionary for a semiotic approach to translation. And anyway, a semiotic approach to translation does not exclude language. Just that as an introduction. So I'm still working on my interpretation of the situation as somewhat biased towards language. We don't know exactly where the bias will stop. When we'll be in a position to say that there's no longer a linguistic bias. That is pretty difficult to predict, but I'm working on the interpretation that there is still some interlingual bias. Right. So when I started reading and thinking about translation more in terms of semiosis, I came about a plethora of terminology. I think in the 2018 book, I listed like 80 terms. And that would be, and those are terms that I used quite often outside of translation studies. Transduction, transposition, transmediation. In literary circles, there's transfiction, transcreation, adaptation, ekphrasis, semio-translation. Then there's interart, shape-shifting, resemiotization, tradaptation, and even in some of the work, something like transvaluation, which talks about the transfer of, or the translation of values across semiotic systems. So my question was, are these all completely different things? Do these words, all of them, refer to completely different things? Or do they have something in common? And if they have something in common, what do they have in common? My answer at this point would be that they are different, but they are at the same time similar. They have something in common, and that is that they all refer to some kind of semiotic action or some kind of semiotic work that is being done. And that is the point that I would like to explore. So the idea started to grow that without excluding language, translation, I think, is best to be described as a semiotic activity, a semiotic action or work that is performed. So just quickly in translation studies, translation has been famously conceptualized by Jacobson in the three terms that he created, but with the proviso that in all of his cases, language is a crucial factor. So intersemiotic translation for Jacobson would not be between painting and music, but between language and painting, or between language and music. And I think that's where the linguistic bias still lies within Jacobson's conceptualization. There has been all kinds of, I'm definitely not the first person thinking about these things. There have been all kinds of thinking. In the 1990s, Ubaldus de Koning wrote some interesting work on intersemiotic translation. Christiane Nord, I think, interestingly enough, not working in semiotics, but understanding that there's work at play. Translation as a purposeful activity, as an action. I think it's all kinds of roots from which one can draw. Yes, but I still think that in most of these, there's still quite linguistic bias. In semiotics, actually, it was fascinating for me to find that a lot has been written about translation. Dinda Gorlee from the 1990s, I think 94 was her first book. Susan Petrilli's work, Translation in 2003. Umberto Eco in the 90s, 70s, 80s, 90s wrote about translation semiotically. The biosemiotician Jesper Hofmeyr in his 2008 seminal work on biosemiotics refers to translation. Kalevi Kuhl, the biosemiotician. Yuri Lotman from Tartu in the 70s already, I think, developed his theory of culture as a theory of translation, right? And in Brazil, João Queiroz in the early 2000s did a lot of work on intersemiotic translation. So it was interesting for me to find these works outside of translation studies. In the field of multimodality, Theo van Leeuwen, Günter Kress, Kayo Halloran, and now later on Jeff Besmer, Elisabetta Adami, I think, who is a colleague in the same university as Sarah Ramos Pintos. So they all base their theories of meaning making on translational processes. They obviously have different terms here and there, but it's all about a translational process. The famous intermediality studies scholar Lars Ellerstrom used translation also to describe processes between transferring meaning between different media, right? I think that, generally speaking, translation studies has developed a bit further in their thinking about translation than semiotics, because quite often in semiotic studies, semiotic sources and targets are still seen as quite stable. The notions of equivalence, I think, is quite sometimes quite conservative, and there's still quite a strong influence from language. For instance, Dinda Gorlee's work, though semiotic, is basically all about language. But the point that I would like to make is that it was kind of an eye-opener for me to start reading about something that was in 2013 when I started on working on semiotics, that was not that widely known in translation studies, but the translation part was really well known in semiotics at that point. Right. So my thesis, I think, is that translation is a technical term that refers to the underlying process of all meaning making. And I will now go in detail into trying to explain that and why I think so. So if we ask as a basic question, and yesterday in the Q&A this was asked a number of times, so what is meaning? Or what is meaning making? Or to use the technical term for the process of meaning making, it is semiosis. So the field of study is semiotics, and the topic it studies is semiotics, but the process of meaning making is called semiosis. So what the heck is this? Charles Peirce, the famous American semiotician, philosopher, actually polymath. He was a mathematician, a chemistry expert. He published virtually in about 7 or 8 different fields. He developed a theory of meaning, and he says when we think about meaning, it is primarily at its base the translation of a sign into another sign or into another system of signs. Before I explain that, I just want to explain the reference. So Peircean scholarship follows particular conventions, and that is that in for the collected papers of Charles Peirce. So I'll quickly explain. Peirce published very little during his life, but he wrote about 100,000 pages by hand. And these have been added together into what is now known as the, or some of these, about 10,000 pages, have been added together into what is now known as the collected papers of Peirce. So the CP stands for collected papers of Peirce, and the 4 refers to the sections, and the .127 refers to the paragraph. So we don't reference by page and by date and so on. It's just collected papers, section 4, number 127, and they're all marked, and you just go and look for them there, right? So just to explain that. So Peirce says, and I think he saw this very clearly, that meaning isn't in anything, except maybe in translation. Meaning isn't something that is in a word or in a source text or in anything that you observe. The thing that you observe has potential meaning, which you can translate into further meaning. So the only way to understand meaning is to explain what you think you understand in another sign. So it means that there's nothing outside of, no, it's not that there's nothing outside of science, but meaning doesn't happen outside of science. You only create meaning by changing one sign into another sign. If I ask you, what is the meaning of the word dog? And you say dog, you have not explained the meaning, you've just repeated the sound. If you say it's an animal, domesticated, 4 legs, furry, long teeth, wagging tail, whatever, then you've translated the sign dog to explore its meanings, right? So this means that meaning is not in the source text, but it is something that it's something that emerges in translation, in a process of being translated. Meaning comes about. It is a relationship that is created between an observer and an observing thing. And in that relationship, the meaning emerges, or meanings emerge. Right? So it's essentially a relational thing. You have to think about meaning not as something there or something here or something in here, but as a relation between a living organism and something else. And that something else Peirce calls a representamen or a sign vehicle. So what in popular English we call a sign, for Peirce isn't yet a sign. It's only the representamen of the sign process. It's only the vehicle that carries the sign process. And this is why I argued in the first lecture that we do not translate meaning, because meaning isn't there to translate. We can infer, interpret meaning based on patterns of constraints, and we can then try and replicate the patterns of constraint with the hope of creating similar kind of meanings as the ones that in our readers, as the ones that we interpreted. But I think it would be wrong to say that we translate meaning. As a shorthand for what we do, yes, but I think when we look at it in more detail, there's more to it. Right. So the meaning in terms of translation, meaning isn't there to take out, to carry over. Meaning is the effect, the emergent effect of a process of interpreting and translating. And I will go into more detail, step by step, trying to explore this further. So, because most of you, as I've seen in your project proposals, work in interlingual translation, I think I'm going to try and explain this semiotic process in terms of that. So there are also semiotic processes where you engage with natural signs, like seeing the sun, seeing a rock. But in communication, which happens in culture, semiosis is intentional. So I am sitting here today with a kind of an idea in my head of what I want to communicate, and I hope that you will kind of get something roughly similar out of that. But as we all know, once you've said a word, it's no longer yours. It now becomes for the interpreter to interpret. Right. So, but if we then just limited ourselves for the moment to communication, where the semiosis is intentional, the process could be something like follow. The sender, if we use Jacobson's communication model, the sender forms an idea, creates an idea of what they would like to say and communicate. Then they consider the semiotic resources that they have available, and they constrain those semiotic resources, the semiotic material that they have available, but based on the fact that based on how relevant it is for what they want to say, how relevant it is for what they want to communicate, but also how relevant they think it is for the audience, right? So this process assumes, in communication and cultural communication, assumes that there are shared conventions. So shared conventions here would be alphabets. It would be the grammatical, the syntactical, morphological rules of a particular language. It would be genre as an assumed convention. It would be registers. It would entail all kinds of things. So when somebody communicates, they have something that they would like to say. They select the most appropriate semiotic resources based on what they want to say and based on what they think the audience knows and what might best help the audience to understand things in a similar way if they want to have similarity. Right. On the receiving side, then, the receiver interprets the meaning by entering into a relationship with a sign vehicle. So the translator creates a written text, which is the sign vehicle, and it's constrained in a certain way through genre, through language, through syntax, through morphology, through pragmatics, rhetorical constraints. And the receiver takes all of these as indications of what the sender could have or would have meant. Right? It's a process of inference. So you can see that meaning-making processes are based on hypotheses about a lot of things. It's based about inferences about a lot of things. There is no pure coding-decoding process. It is a much more complex cognitive semiotic process. So meaning is a relational construct based on processes of translation, interpreting, and inference. Yes, those relationships. But what is important is that one has to remember that the sender, when they constructed their initial meaning, they didn't create that de novo. They used earlier interpretations and earlier translations, earlier semiotic processes to get them to what they wanted to say, right? So when we are born into the stream of semiosis, the stream of meaning making, and you just sort of fall halfway in it, not halfway, somewhere in it, and you learn about its past, and from patterns from the past, you learn to know that these patterns can be used to create certain meanings. And based on that, you create new meanings, right? So let's say we take Hamlet, and I'm not a literary scholar, but let's take Hamlet as a source text. Now we can explain that the translator reads it, interprets it, come to a certain interpretation, translates that into a target text, the audience interprets that again, translate that into their understanding, and so on and so on. But Shakespeare didn't create Hamlet de novo. He created Hamlet out of the meaning-making processes to which he was exposed before writing Hamlet. Right. So semiosis is a vast, complex, conglomerate process, and I will try and show you some demonstrations of this, animations of this a bit later. So, as I said on Monday, semiotic process always entail both translation and interpretation, right? It's impossible for us to separate these two things. They are entangled. When you interpret, you do so by translating, and when you translate, you do so by interpreting. And maybe somebody can at some point come up with one term, but I think what these two terms at this point help us is that they separate two facets of a very complicated process. And maybe we don't want one term, because then we will lose the granularity of this more fine-grained analysis. And this process, in theory, never ends. I will talk to you about some of it later. Right. So I'm going to give you a second quote from Peirce to help us further understand how meaning making works. So Peirce said, this is in section 2, paragraph 228. He says, a sign or a representament. So let me first say, for Peirce, this is probably from his earlier work, but in his later work, the sign for Peirce is the relationship between the representament, the object, and the interpretant, which I will explain to you now. The sign is not what we in popular English call a sign. That is only the vehicle. That's only the representament of the sign. The sign is a relational process of three things that need to be related for it to be a sign. If there's just an object and a representament and an object, there's not yet a sign in Peirce's terms. Right. So Peirce very simply says a sign is something. This thing can be a material thing, like the table in front of me, the computer in front of me, my cell phone. It can be a material thing, but it can also be an idea, right? So meaning-making processes start, the representament can be a material thing, a created thing, something that a culturally created thing, a technological thing, something that was created naturally, or it could be ideas, institutions, laws, habits. So anything can be a sign. Now, a representament is a sign, becomes part of the sign because it stands for something. That's the yellow highlight, right? It stands in the place of something. And that is how all living organisms relate with their environment. They experience something and they take that as standing for something. When a bacterium touches sugar with its membrane, it interprets that, and interpret here is already too far-fetched. It semioticizes that material information as food, as something desirable, and it would swim in the direction of where the most sugar is, right? So it takes something materially or ideationally in front of it, and it takes it as standing for something else. Now, it always stands to somebody. So for me, between a rock and the wind that blows over the rock, there's no semiosis. It's just physical interaction. But when I observe as a living organism, if there's a somebody involved, a living organism involved, then meaning making arises and emerges, right? And then obviously it does so only in some respect or capacity, right? We know this from metaphors. For instance, metaphors are only valid for a certain comparison. They're not valid in every aspect. If I call you a pig, I don't mean you live in a sty. I just mean you untidy, right? So let me show you an example of how this works out. Right. I come to the KU Leuven campus here in Antwerp. I walk down the passage, which is wooden brick wall, and I see a wooden structure in this brick wall. It's usually colored a bit differently. In my case, it's a kind of a grayish, bluish, grayish color. The wall is cream. It's a bit thinner than the wall. So I observe that here's something different, right? It's a wooden structure in a brick wall. By experience, I'm able to relate this wooden structure to a concept, namely door. I didn't, in short, we would say I saw the door. But Peirce points out to us that we're actually seeing the wooden structure and then we're linking it to the concept door, because door is a socially constructed object for us, right? And then, because I know what a door is, I can form the interpretant, let me enter. Or, no, this is not the one there where I want to be, or is this locked or isn't it locked? I can think any kind of thing, right? So I have the wooden structure signifying door, and because I'm able to relate those things, and within the context of my knowledge, I can come to an interpretant saying, let me enter here. So just to generalize and clarify it again, Peirce says there's something that stands for something else to someone, right? And in meaning-making processes, they should always be related. In technical terms, he calls the something a representative. He calls the something else an object, and he calls the someone or the meanings that are made, the effects of the sign, he calls the interpretant. It's sometimes the person, it's sometimes just the effect of the sign, and they are related. Now, what is interesting is that Peirce conceptualizes this process of relating something to something else and creating an interpretant out of that. And it seems on the surface that this is an isolated event. This is one sign having one object creating one interpretant. But and then the process starts from scratch. But it is actually, if you read Peirce further, it's not that simple. So what actually happens is, I observe something, I connect it to something else, I create an interpretant. That interpretant, in other words, the blue number 3 here at the right-hand bottom, becomes the representative in the following iteration of the sign process. So let's say I observe the wooden structure in the wall. I realize this is I link it to the concept door, and I say, let me enter. When I think about let me enter, I could think that the let me enter as a interpretant, as a meaning, then becomes the sign vehicle for another to further the train of thought that I'm in, right? I'm here to see Jack, right? And then I see Jack and we carry on with the conversation. So you should not see signs as individual isolated things, but as always linked to a process where the effect of one sign becomes the starting point of another sign, right? The interpretant in one sign process becomes the representative, and that starts a further process. And this can happen ad infinitum. Usually it ends when we go to sleep, and tomorrow we start with the first thing that comes to mind. Or I'm in a train of thought, and somebody enters in my office and asks me something else, then I have to stop that and I start a new process. So it's a messy kind of thing, but the point is it's always process. So meaning is created by translating representaments into interpretants by relating the representaments to objects. I've said sign vehicles do not have meaning, they only have potential meaning. Until a sign has been interpreted, we do not know what its meaning is, but we can describe the potential meanings that it could have under different conditions. And we can imagine, therefore you have to imagine also different contexts where it could have different meanings. So translation is the process that gives meaning. Meaning isn't given and transferred. Meaning potential is interpreted, made, created, it emerged, and it is remade, recreated in following processes. If I don't think I've said this before, but this means that language isn't the only sign system that we have. Smell, for instance, signs of olfactory signs. Imagine smelling your grandma's favorite dish. The memories of holidays with her, of visits, that comes up. So something like smell, something like touch, something like what you hear, what you taste, all could be representaments that are possible to interpret as having certain meanings. If you walk down the street and you smell the smell of fresh bread, that becomes a sign of there's a bakery close by, and you can follow the smell as it grows stronger and you can get to the bakery, right? So if we want to talk about communication or information, it's not only made by language or by visual material like photos and so on. It's also made by smells and tastes and all these kinds of things, right? So a translation process actually entails limiting meanings, eliminating all the less probable of all the possible meanings under the auspices of pragmatic and contextual relevance, right? So I'm asking, out of the 1,000 things that this sign can mean, which is probably the one that is most relevant now for the context that I need to use it now? And that doesn't mean it's the right one. It doesn't mean it's the only one, but I try to make the most relevant one. So the question then is, if translation is this underlying process, why are translation processes so different? Why is there interlingual translation, intersemiotic translation, transadaptation, adaptation, localization? How does that work? So I think it's the same process constrained differently, right? So when I translate intersemiotic, interlingually, there are certain constraints that I follow. When I do interart, I'm still translating one sign into another sign, but the constraints of doing that, the material that I work with, the conventions, the genres, all these kinds of things are different, and therefore we can identify in a similar process, we can identify different characteristics because of the different constraints. So we have to think sort of similarity and difference here as very closely related. Right. So translation then refers to the negentropic semiotic work that happens both on the production side and the reception side, sorry for the typo, to determine and create the most relevant meaning. And it is only done by translating signs into signs. This means that not only professional translators translate, all living organisms translate. When I think, I translate my idea into another idea. If I talk to you, I translate my idea into another idea. If I engage with my dog, I translate my idea into another idea, and the dog translates my ideas and my actions into ideas, meanings. Let's call them ideas, meanings on her side. So it means that anything can be a sign. Not only words, not only conventional symbols, but as Charles Peirce famously said, the position of a sunflower's head is a sign of the position of the sun. So not between, it's a sign not for the sun, and it's a sign not for the sunflower, but it's a sign for us that observes it. And it's meaningful for the sunflower to be turned towards the sun because it maximizes the energy that it can retain from the sun. Right. So Peirce also then went into, so he had this general process of representament, object, interpretant that's being related. But he then said you can actually classify types of signs in various ways. So there's a three level classification, there's a 10 type classification, there's a 66 level classification, and there's a 256, I think, which I actually haven't found anybody understanding. João Queiroz understands the 66 categories. I don't understand them. I battle to understand the 10. It's very complicated stuff, but I'm going to show you the 3 types of signs. And that is, you ask the question, in what sense or in what way does an representament stand for its object? So an icon is a representament that stands for its object by resembling it. And the best example here is a photo. If you see a photo of your grandfather, you don't have to have an explanation. You just recognize resemblance. And that is how an icon works. An index is a representament that stands for the object, for its object, by contiguity, by being in contact with it. In other words, either having been caused by it. So think of the track of a lion. The lion isn't there, but the track is an index, is a pointer to the fact that there was a lion. Or as I showed on Monday, if I point my finger to somebody, it indicates that person. If the person isn't in the room, it doesn't help in the same space as I am. If the person isn't contiguous to me, I can't point at the person, right? Because the person just isn't there. And then the third type of relationship is a symbol where the representament stands for the object by a generality. And this is what de Saussure said about signs. For him, all signs are symbols. They are conventional, arbitrary relations created between things. But I think Peirce here gives us, with icons and indexes, gives us a way of basing our semiotic processes in the materialities of our world. It's not only a matter of differences between concepts, like Saussure would, my simple interpretation of Saussure would suggest, right? So let's say the logic of signs differ, and therefore icons stand for the objects in different ways from indexes and from symbols. So my first description was translation is the underlying process of meaning making, of semiosis. The second one is that translation is biosemiotic, and I'll talk about that on Monday, so I'm leaving this slide blank. Translation is also always process, as I said, and therefore to understand that we need to sort of train our minds to think in terms of a process ontology and not a substance ontology. We typically think of meaning as a substance, as a thing that can be taken out and carried over, right? While we need to think of it in terms of process And a process ontology says that process is primarily and substance sediments out of process. It's not that substance is primary and substance then has to be changed into process. Process ontology, I'm talking here about Alfred North Whitehead and many others who have written about this, right? So translation is the process that drives meaning. It can only be a process. It cannot be a substance. So the question, I think, is not how to change substance, but, well, that is also a question, but the primary question is, how does process take form, right? If meaning is at a process, how do we stabilize it? How do we sediment it to a point where we can store it, where we can share memories of it, where we can at least make meaning? Because if the process is just changing all the time in my head, how do I make meaning when I want to talk to Jack, for instance? So the question of translation is, for me, the first question is not to explain how to change substance, but to explain how to substantialize change, if I can formulate it in that way. So yes, the problem is not change, but stability. How the sedimentation of meanings take place. And obviously that helps us if we understand that helps us if we want to change sedimented meanings. If we understand how they came about, then that would help us. I'm going to skip this point because I come back to it later. Semiosis, this process of meaning making, as I said, happens ad infinitum, or it can happen ad infinitum. So on a species level, it will happen until the species dies out. On a cultural level, it will happen until the culture dies out. On my personal level, it will happen until I die out, or until I go to bed, or until I get interrupted. But in theory, it can just continue. And that's why I created the terms incipient and subsequent signs to indicate not the substance nature of source text and target text, but the process nature. So the incipient and subsequent signs, which I use as terms for source and target text, are moments in a process which we pick out, right? They are semi-stabilized moments in a particular process, and they can be very stabilized, like in a law codex, or they can be quite unstable, like in literary text. But they variously stabilized moments in a process. And I will talk about this on next Thursday again, but translational processes always, I think, try to create negative entropy. So entropy means the flattening out of energy, right? If there's entropy, there's no energy, there's nothing that you can use to make work with. Negative entropy is when you work against that entropy by creating things. And I think translation processes are all the time working against entropy. But as I said, I will get back to the details of that. All right. So as a process, we can describe semiosis as indeterminate. It's not possible to absolutely pinpoint the meaning of any sign. I've spoken to Hendrik Kockart, who is the terminologist here at KU Leuven, a number of times this week, and clearly terminologists are people who do semiotic work by imposing as many constraints as they can to try and have technical terminology that as determinate as possible. But no sign can ever be absolutely determinate. Signs work very well, especially symbols, because they're quite vague. And it's actually a feature. If signs were not vague, we wouldn't have been able to do that many things with them. but it means that they are vague and that they are not exact. They are general, they are quite often inconsistent, and they are quite often incomplete. And this is the de facto of meaning making. We shouldn't posit a Platonic absolute meaning, perfect meaning somewhere, and our meaning making is just a derivative of that. Meaning making is indeterminate, vague, general, inconsistent, and incomplete, at least in the universe that we know. So I am going to just quickly show you two animations of translation processes that I have asked animator to create for me. Let me see if I can manage this. You know that I'm from the BC generation, so computers are not my first thing. Okay, so there is it, and then I have to go back here and share window. Right, Jack, can you just say is my window right? It's right. So in this animation, I've asked an animator to model translation for me as an electromagnetic process. And I'm going to play this for you and stop it regularly to explain what I'm trying to do. The reason why I did this is because when it's really difficult to represent process on a written page, because you see the whole thing at the same time. You don't get the sense of how a process develops, and the fact that not everything is there at every moment, because visually you can see the whole thing at the same time. So I've asked him to make these animations for me to show us how translational processes emerge over time. Right. So as I try to explain to you, translational processes always start from multiple sources, right? So I have, I don't want to go back now because it's going to waste time, but there are 5 sources here. So it could be books, it could be people talking, it could be the internet, it could be photos, any kind of semiotic source, right? And when I start living, these things become part of my mental semiotic framework, if I can call it that, right? So these things move irregularly, complexly, non-linearly. And in a translation process, they somehow form a little bit of a pattern, right? So it's just a kind of a circular kind of thing. So this I would call the source text, or the incipient sign. So the incipient sign is an emergent pattern created from quite a number of source materials, right? And sometimes the pattern is very clear, and sometimes, like in this case, it's a pretty vague pattern, right? But so this is the source text, which the translator then interprets, and there are different streams of meaning that the translator interprets. So let's say it's a poem. There's rhyme, there's rhythm, there's syntax, there's the genre of the poem, there's the theme of the poem, that are all simultaneously being interpreted and streamed to form a second little pattern, which we could call our target text. What is interesting with the green line at the top is that sometimes in translations, meanings that were not part of the source text become part of the target text, because in the interpretation process, the translator engages with semiotic material that they have been exposed to, that the author might not have been exposed to in a interlingual translation, right? And then the text gets interpreted, and you again have multiple streams of meaning. I might interpret the meaning of this target text as the purple line. You might interpret this as the yellow line, etc., etc. Right? And so the process goes on. The second one I wanted to show you is I asked to have a propeller move in 4 dimensions, and every blade of the propeller should have like a robe flowing behind it, right? And I will show you why. So let's assume for the moment that the red blade here is the representamen. On the right-hand side, that greenish, yellowish one would be the object, and the yellow one on the left-hand side would be the interpretant. So a meaning-making process means that representamen object interpretant spins at the level of white light. Biosemioticians, neuroscientists would say that interpreting an icon takes like 2 nanoseconds, interpreting an index 4, and interpreting a symbol, I think 6 or 7, right? So symbols take the most effort to interpret. But what you have is a continuous process in the brain of this spinning of representamen object interpretant leading to representamen object interpretant leading to representamen object interpretant, right? So this is what the moving, and it moves through space. It moves in the cultural space, if you want to call it that. What the lints or the robes at the behind the blade show is the meaning effects of the semiotic process, right? So in this moment, if you observe let me first show you. You can't observe a pattern if the thing moves. It's pretty much to observe a pattern. When I freeze it like here, you can see, okay, the red one looks like this, the blue one looks like that, the green one looks like that. A moment later, the pattern is different, right? So with this, I'm trying to explore how meaning-making processes is literally ephemeral from moment to moment. And what we are doing in cultures and in learning is to try and sediment it and stabilize it. Okay, I want to get back to my PowerPoint because I should be starting to finish now. Right. Translation is also a complex semiotic process, and I spoke about that on Tuesday. I'm not going to deal with that again. So if I say translation is semiotic work, and if I say that it's neg-entropic, in other words, working against entropy, creating new things, what does that entail? What does that mean? Right. I think the first thing that we do when we translate is that we create relationships. We relate representaments, objects, and interpretants to one another. We relate to the representaments that we observe by creating objects, by linking them to objects and creating interpretants out of that. So we're creating relationships. But we're also imposing constraints. I've tried to show that the propeller in 4 dimensions, moving left, right, up, down, back, forward, and in time, right? So time, space constrain the meaning-making process. We constrain the process by imposing limits, limiting the possibilities. Using a particular genre rules out certain meanings immediately. Obviously, you can also combine genres and you can rework genres, but the assumption with the genre is a kind of a convention. We impose form on different signs. And all of this, I think, happens under the pragmatic intentions that we have. We use meaning making to survive and to thrive and to understand and to communicate. So there's always this pragmatic intent that drives the choice of constraints and the creation of relationships. People often says that if I present this work, I'm claiming that everything is translation. I'm not claiming that everything is translation. I'm claiming that you can enter into a translational relationship with everything, or that you can study the translational aspect of semiotic processes. So if somebody translates news, I don't need to call that news bulletin a translation. I can just say there's a translational aspect to that news bulletin. If somebody translates a novel, I don't have to call that a translation. And here I sort of argue against Thury's conceptualization of translation as understood in the target audience. So there might be things that the target audience don't see as translations, but as a scholar, I can pick up the translational aspect thereof. Right. So I'm closing. Where does social cultural reality comes from? I will deal with this in more detail on next Thursday. But for anything to exist, you need to do work. For anything to come about, you need to do work. Work is done when impositions are, when constraints are imposed, and when the imposition of constraints creates energy that you use to do work with. Right? Culture and society then emerge when work is done on semiotic material. Rocks emerge if work is done on sand and minerals and these kinds of things. Society cultures emerge when work is done on semiotic material. For instance, a language emerges when constraints are imposed on vocal cord sounds. Maria Timoshko, in a book on neuroscience that was published at Tartu a few years back, said that neuroscience found that in the first 6 months, I think, of their lives, babies can make any sound, can make the sounds of any language. By a year or 18 months, they can only make the sounds of the language that they have spoken with their parents. If they then want to learn another language, they have to learn the sounds again. And you know how embarrassing that is to learn to pronounce sounds that you didn't grow up with, right? So a language emerges when constraints are imposed on the kind of sounds that you can make. Art emerges when constraints are imposed on colors. Or if you hit a drum, you can hit it 1, 2, 3, 4, or you can 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. You can create rhythms by constraining the material. So I think anything that we know today from society culture has a translational aspect because it has been translated from a previous sign. 47 seconds over my time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Cobus. I'm sure, thank you very much indeed, and also for staying on time. I see there's already a question from Yves Gambier, so let's open the floor for questions now. I have a couple as well, but Yves, you've preempted my my questions. Please take the floor, Yves. You could use your microphone. If you'll need to unmute yourself. So while Yves is working on his microphone, maybe I can ask my questions. So I have a comment perhaps and one question. My comment refers to a question I asked you during the opening, which was about how to visualize your conceptualization of translation. And in fact, with your 2 visualizations, you provided an interesting answer to that question. So thank you. My question is, how can we distinguish between a semiotic process and a physical process? And that relates to your examples of the sunflower turning towards the sun. And I assume because the sunflower is a living thing, that action that resulted from some kind of semiotic process, but perhaps also a physical process. The same with a human smelling bread, thinking there's food there and I'll move in that direction. But there appear to be some limits in the concept because wind running over a rock is not a semiotic process, but rather a physical process. So could you elaborate on how you see the connection between semiotic processes and physical processes? Perhaps you'll cover that in the biosemiotics lecture.
No. I think it is a core question. Maybe if you can just switch off your mic, I have.
Yeah, you'll have to turn your volume off on your laptop, on your computer. So, but make sure your mic is still on.
Turn the volume off.
Yeah, mute your.
Right, can you hear me?
I can hear you here in the room.
Okay, cool. Right, no, because we were we were ghosting around here. No, so this is one of the fundamental questions in semiosis, in biosemiosis, in studies on philosophical studies, materiality studies. Is there a difference between purely physical interactions and semiotic interactions? Now, somebody like Karen Barrett would say no, it's the same thing. A famous semiotician and biosemiotician, John Deely, would have said no. The generalized processes in nature are already semiotic. I am of a different opinion. Let me first say, then, so you have what is called pansemiotism, right? So that would be Barrett, Deely, and others who say this everything has a semiotic dimension to it. Then you have the sort of the other extreme of this debate would be people who say it's actually only humans that semioticize. It's only humans that use signs. Other animals just interpret things, but they don't interpret signs, right? But that's because that one takes a specific definition of sign, right? Or there's some people who would say, well, higher animals are semiotic and so on. I'm working on trying to figure out an intermediate position between these two, and I'm planning for this to be like a 10-year project because it is a massive conceptual problem. At this point, I think to answer the question, you need to understand similarity and difference. No, not understand. You need to maintain similarity and difference in your thinking. So yes, in natural processes, let's say material processes, physical processes, before life processes, there are generalized patterns, right? I won't call them semiotic because they are not related to the interests of a semiotic agent, right? How to make that argument cogently is the point. So what I'm trying to argue is that, yes, there are generalities from the physical world until our most fanciful flights of fantasy, right? There are generalities. You can point out the generalities, but there are also specificities that biological processes show that physical processes don't show. For instance, interest, maintaining the self, procreation. I mean, a rock can break and become little stones, but it's not procreating. It's not maintaining a metabolism, right? So I think for some reason, or for the reason which I cannot yet explain in detail, with the advent of life, new properties emerged. And they are obviously physical, material. They're obviously biological, but for me, they are also semiotic. the bit of a school, the materialist school that's evolving at Queen's University under Piotr Blumczynski, would also argue that, for instance, Matt Valler, one of his PhD students, would say that the wall takes the measure of the wind that blows against it. And he uses actually Latour to make that argument. I think he misinterprets Latour, but that's my that's my assumption. We can have a long debate about that. But yes, so this is a very short answer to a massive problem, and I haven't seen any satisfactory answers yet to that problem.
Thank you. No follow-up because we've got 10 years to follow up on that question. Hopefully, Yves, have you been able to manage your microphone issues?
No.
But we hear you. So
now we switch it on again, off again.
Oh, okay.
Can you hear me now?
Questions are in chat now.
Can you hear me
yes,
now?
If we can. Yes,
okay,
sir, we can.
I wrote I have 3 questions, and I wrote them in the conversation. First one, why do you prefer to refer to translate and not to transformation when you are dealing with meanings?
Good morning, Yves. Sorry, because I was muted. My headphone was muted. I didn't hear the first part of your question. Would you mind just repeating it for me? I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's okay. Why do you refer to translate and not to transformation when you are dealing with meaning? I mean, dealing is a translation of a sign into another system of sign. Why not a transformation? Because I think that in transformation, there is something more dynamic.
Yeah, I hear you, and obviously there could be a debate about this. I think in scholarly context, we make words mean what we want them to mean. And for me, conceptualizing translation as a energetic, negentropic semiotic process where transformative work is performed, is dynamic enough and transformative enough. But you see, the thing is, so that's one part of the question, of the answer. The second part relates to what Jack just asked. Transformations take place everywhere. So physical properties are transformed into other physical properties. Biological properties are transformed into other biological properties. So there's this universal of transformation that takes place everywhere. For me, translation is then the form that transformation takes in semiotic processes. And for me, that is kind of a sensible answer, but I assume that not everybody would find it sensible. But that's the answer that I would give. If the moment you so the conceptual problem here is to differentiate between similar things under different constraints, if I can put it that way. And that's why I would use translation as the term here. And also following Peirce, hanging my or waging my bets with a well-known theorist always helps. But I don't see a reason to not make the difference. Yeah.
Okay, Jack, can I ask a second question? How do you see the relation between the semiotic process and the relevance theory?
Yeah. That's a very good question, and I've actually when I was just finishing my PhD in 1996, my supervisor sent me Sperber and Wilson's book on relevance theory. By that time, I was too far or too close to finishing it. So I read the book, but I didn't use much of it in my PhD. And then only recently, probably in the last year or two, I have sort of grappled with the suggestion that meaning making is a process of reducing possibilities. Now, the question then is, on what basis do you reduce the possibility? There should be a logic to reducing the possibility. And I found relevance theory, though not necessarily devoid of problems, but I find that a useful tool to say it is the interest of the, and this comes from Günter Kress, the multimodality scholar. It also comes from Terence Deacon. So the same ideas float in neurobiology and in multimodality and in translation and in linguistics, where relevance theory comes from. So the final determining factor of the final process of reducing possible meanings to one actual meaning that I'm going to act on, I think is done by the interest of the sign taker, the meaning maker on the reception side. And I think relevance theory explains to some extent what the factors would be. You would first try to look for the most relevant answer or the most relevant meaning, and then if that doesn't work, you would do more semiotic work to determine further meanings. So for me, they are, relevance theory offers, for me, some kind of tool to talk further about the interest of the sign receiver.
Okay, thank you. My last question is about conventions. Several times you referred to conventions. Can you tell us how do they change over time? Who changed conventions?
I think something like a convention or a genre, or Peirce talks about habits, the generalities that things take. I think one answer would be that they self-organize, that they are self-organized systems that doesn't have a pilot in control of them somewhere. They just emerge over time. But I think sociology of translation will tell us that there are agents that contribute, and specifically patrons. So if you take Bourdieu's theory, if somebody has massive social capital in a field, their use of terminology, for instance, or of a particular convention would probably be more effective, more energetic translation work than somebody coming from the outside and trying to suggest, a new habit. I think social media these days are fantastic places to study how these processes emerge. I mean, one of the fascinating concepts is that a company tried to use memes as an advertisement strategy, and it completely failed. Made memes don't work. The effect of memes lies somewhere else. You can devise a meme as well as you want. It's not necessarily going to trend. So if I think from a complexity perspective, I would say these kinds of things are self-organizing systems that emerge over time, but that certain agents might have relatively more influence than other agents in this process.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks for attending.
Okay, thank you. There is a question in the chat. Uyama, I see your hand is raised. Would you like to ask your question with your microphone? Perhaps there's microphone problems. If that's the case, then I'll ask Cobus to read the question from the chat and then to rephrase it, please.
Right, so this is my own little question for my research. If cultural signs exist in the context of oral literature, would clan names fall, or can clan names be called cultural signs? I would indeed think so, yes. So for instance, in Zulu and Xhosa culture, there are clans, and they don't necessarily live in one place. They can be spread over cities or whatever, but they have clan names, and every clan has a kind of a name for that clan, but also certain traditions and certain ways in which you greet people from that clan, and so on and so on. So yes, indeed, clan names would be cultural signs. And if cultural signs have already been translated, when South African praise poets use their traditional clothes, and the traditional clothes are linked to the clans, do they show their memory of the clothes' historical meaning? Indeed, yes. So when you use a clan name, you don't have to tell the whole story of the clan. With a name, you recall the whole memory, right? So I haven't really spoken much about memory. If you want to read more about memory and translation and semiotics, Yuri Lotman has done a lot of work on that. But indeed, if you dress in a certain way, you call up a whole system of meaning. So the dress becomes an index of that system of meaning. And then you can go and say, okay, so what is the content? And then you explain it by symbols. But just as a dress is an index of a particular identity or a particular culture. So indeed, yes. Thanks. It's a good question. And I think using these kinds of theories to study local indigenous, if you want to call it that, practices, I think is really worthwhile.
Thank you. Do we have a question from Philippe?
Hi, yeah. Thank you for your lecture. I actually have a twofold question. One is a bit more methodological and one is a bit more philosophical, conceptual. Okay. You mentioned that translation is a process, the difference between a process ontology and a substance ontology. So translation is a process, translation is semiosis, translation is meaning making. Yet you also mentioned that it's ephemeral. So how would we completely research this kind of process, even if it only happens in a blink, and we can't even maybe capture it in the speed that it happens in?
So you want me to answer that one first, right? So this is, yes, methodologically, this is indeed a problem. Now, I would say that you can start out with a philosophical position that says meaning making is an ephemeral process. And that you then start looking at ways in which it becomes captured and which it sedimentizes, right? The first, I think, process would just be individual memory, right? So if I have a thought that I don't remember, then pretty much that thing's gone, right? It has existed for a moment and then it's gone, never to appear again. Unless there are traces of that in my memory that I just cannot remember, but which can later on be activated. So I would first say individual memory. I would then say, secondly, shared memory, like cultures. So cultures have in their, let's say, oral traditions, they would have a vast corpus of previous experiences, just memory-wise, right? And then as cognitive, let me call it cognitive or semiotic technology developed, right? Well, even before that, we have things like rhythm and rhyme to help maintain the memories, right? So there are all kinds of rhetorical structures that help stabilize these ephemeral processes. Then with technology, writing, printing, digital artifacts, right? So when I want to understand, let's say, Uyama's Xhosa culture, I can study the clothes as a repository of a particular way of thinking, right? So I think there are a variety of ways in which we sediment meanings. What we do when we study them is, yes, the process is gone. What we have is the effect of the process. And if you then say this artifact, right, whether it be a text or a photo or whatever, is an index of the process that created it. Then you can say, okay, in other words, just think for the moment, if you see the track of a lion, your logic to understand the track of a lion work backwards, right? So you say, here's a track. What does this track tell me about the lion that was here yesterday or the day before or whatever? The way in which a track is formed, if you know how to read it, you can say this lion was hungry, this lion was old, this lion was tired, this lion walked here 2 days ago or 5 days ago, right? So the sign that was created carries indexes of the process that created it. And that is what we do. So there's a beautiful book by Rick Parmentier, anthropologist. I will see if I can just get the title and ask Jack to forward it to you, to the group, where he basically says that anthropology is a process in which we study sign processes, but from the end of them backwards, right? You study artifacts in an anthropological setting. You say this artifact is the process of a semiotic, is the effect of a semiotic process, and then you try and work backwards from that. And you had a philosophical question.
Yes, thank you very much. I think I just had too narrow of a perspective of it, but yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's something you mentioned and I noted it down, but I think it might have been very coincidental. You said semiotic work is desirable. And it made me think, is it? Is it always? It just happened on the top of my head. And it made me think of Michel Foucault, sorry, someone's at the door, and the will to knowledge. But do we all have a will to translate in this idea of semiotic work? Do we all want to participate in this semiotic work? Do we all want to create meaning, or is it inevitable? That was kind of the philosophical thing I thought about.
Yeah. So if I said that semiosis is desirable, or translation is desirable, I'm sorry, I can't remember that I said it. I won't deny that I said it, but I can't remember that I said it, because I can't remember why I would have said it, and that maybe I tried to say something else. Maybe I used the wrong word in the moment. For me, semiosis is not a process of desire only. It could be a process of desire, but it's an inevitable survival process. John Dewey wrote famously that there are 3 basic semiotic responses, and that is avoid, approach, ignore. Right? So if I'm any organism, those are the 3 basic things that I need to figure out. Otherwise, I will not make it. I will just die. Right? Whether I need to run away from something, Whether that thing is food and I should approach it, or love, or mating material, I should approach it, or whether it's just happens, I can just ignore it. Yeah. So obviously with humans, and I haven't studied any of these psychoanalytic kind of things, but I can imagine that that desire would play a role somewhere there, but I haven't got a clue about that. I think Matilde also has a name, a hand up.
Thank you, Cobus. Yes, may I go ahead and ask my question?
Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you. Hello, Cobus. I'm tuning in from Bloemfontein. I enjoyed your lecture very much. I want to ask you about a moral or ethical dimension to the processes that you've described today. And I'm asking from the discipline of music, where when you mentioned that the meaning is not inherent in the source text, it's not there to just excavate. It really resonated with me, because in the discipline of music, we have come to the same understanding where the composer is not the owner of the meaning of their creative work. And someone interpreting has their own agency. But I was wondering where the constraints then are, and if there is a moral or ethical dimension to those constraints in your view.
Yes.
In terms of like faithfulness to the sender or the composer, or yeah, you see what I'm getting at.
Yeah. I definitely think there's a moral, ethical responsibility. Susan Petrilli has spent with Augusto Ponzio, spent basically their lives working out what they call a semioethics. They say that, and you can find their works if you want certain ones. I have a lot of their work with me in PDF form that I could share with you. So they say that the mere fact of semiosis implies ethics, because semiosis is about life and about survival in the first place and about thriving in the second place, and therefore it's inherently an ethical activity. Now, that's a very broad statement and a very broad claim, which I think is true. But when you move into specifics, I think there are a few things to keep in mind. So when I talk about morals and ethics in translation processes, I would not include equivalence as one of them. I think in translation studies, through the work of Christiane Nord, we have sort of come to the point where we say, well, you need somehow to respect and have an ethical position towards the author by respecting them. But that doesn't mean that you have to create a similar meaning, and that equivalence is the goal. You could, I think, in a very ethical way, say, I am going to interpret an author against their intentions, interpreting against the grain, right? But I'm not sure whether you attended the earlier sessions, but I made a strong argument in terms of ecology, that in ecologically sensitive translation studies, cultural studies, including music, we need to respect the other at all times, right? The other cannot just be subjected to our construction. I remember once attending a lecture in Sweden where an opera singer, he was a professor of opera, but a famous opera singer too, I can't remember his name because it's not really my field, where he said that his great task is to kill the author and to impose his own interpretation. And I said, okay, but that does that mean you want to be God? And he said, yes, exactly. And I find that ethically problematic, right? I think that's an ethical position where you overstep your interpretive responsibilities. I think you can deconstruct any set of meaning, but then in a respectful way in which you say, really, I'm not the God over this thing. We are co-constructing, and I used the term the other day that the other should co-constrain us, whether that other be a composer, a writer, or a rock, or a dog. We need to be semiotically, ethically, we need to be co-constrained and open ourselves up for being co-constrained. That's a long answer to your question, but I think it's a great question. I mean, the semiosis implies value because it's a selection of relevant aspects out of a possible sign, possible meaning. And the moment you choose, there's value in the choice you made, right? So it's ethically, morally, it's part of our world. Yes.
Thanks so much.
Okay, wonderful. My timekeeping responsibilities are kicking in here. We're a bit over time. If there is a final burning question, we can take it quickly. Otherwise, so I'll wait in case somebody really needs to ask their question. Okay. If not, then we can close here. So thank you so much, Cobus, for a wonderful third lecture and really thought-provoking. You're taking us into new terrain here, not only for translation studies, but I think for life studies in general, for the philosophy of life as well, and among other areas. So I hope everyone is stimulated by Cobus's words today. And looking ahead for the participants in the room, it's a busy day today. So at 3 p.m., you'll have a live Q&A with Regina Rogel, followed directly thereafter at 4 p.m. with the Q&A with Francis Mus. So enjoy those, and most likely you also have tutorials planned today ongoing. So enjoy your day, and also be aware that on Friday, tomorrow, we have our workshops. So there's preparatory work for the workshops as well. So lots to keep us busy. And so we'll round off here and wish you a stimulating day. Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Cobus.